Today, I am joined by Norman Finkelstein. Norman is a published author of many books, including The Holocaust Industries, Knowing Too Much, and one which is set to be published in the future, titled I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. He was a former professor at DePaul University and has lectured on campuses around the world, including Harvard University, University College Dublin, and famously at Waterloo University in Canada. Now, he's been surrounded by a lot of controversy, but despite that, his work stands on its own and has been recognized and praised by some of the top scholars in the world, including Noam Chomsky, Raoul Hilberg, and many others. So thank you so much for joining me today for this discussion, Norman.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So a lot has been said about you over the years. Some people have been, praising you, calling you a martyr, a voice of truth, and others have been a little bit more critical and harsh with their critiques of you, even going as far as calling you a quote unquote self-hating Jew. So what do you think it is about you, Norman, that makes you such a polarizing figure in the eyes of many people?
It's hard to answer those questions without an element of conceit and vanity entering in, and also there's the tendency towards self-serving explanations. So I'm not really inclined to answer a question like that, because it comes off as me elevating myself on a pedestal, and also I trying to justify what others would construe to be unacceptable conduct or unacceptable language in print. I would simply say at this point in my life, it's almost never said of me. At this point, it has been said. But at this point, one rarely hears it said that I'm a self-hating Jew or a Holocaust denier. That was another common epithet hurled my way, mostly because my essential politics in the Middle East are no longer controversial. The political spectrum has radically shifted. The public opinion on the political spectrum has radically shifted, and most of the opinions that I held, say 20 or 30 years ago, even 40 years ago, at the start of the Lebanon War in 1982, those opinions are just not radical anymore. They're very solidly in the mainstream, and therefore I'm no longer considered a wild man in the wings. I'm articulating with more, I think, detail, but I'm articulating what's the received wisdom, not just in the broad community, but within the American Jewish community under the age of, say, 35, roughly 35, 40, in that age. Under that age, my opinions are actually considered quite conservative. And that age cohort of Jews, there's now a large amount of support for what's called a one-state settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's commonplace to refer to Israel as an apartheid state. In fact, now the mainstream human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, they call Israel or parts of Israel an apartheid state. So my opinions are just not radical anymore. On that particular topic, if you were to switch to something like Ukraine, yes, then my opinions might be considered off the spectrum. But on Israel-Palestine, not really. One of the great tragedies of the Israel-Palestine conflict, in my opinion, one of the many, but for our purposes, one of the main tragedies is just as public opinion shifted, and there are real possibilities for galvanizing public opinion to force a change in American or Canadian foreign policy. Just as that happened, the Palestine cause collapsed. The Palestinian people gave up essentially on resistance. The leadership is just another Arab state. It's just another Arab government without a state. It's any other, the so-called Palestinian Authority is just another kleptocracy. These crooked old men, occasionally a woman, crooked old men with a massive security force of professional torturers at its disposal, trained by Egypt, Jordan, and the CIA. These professional torturers called the security agencies, and who act simply at the behest of Israel and the United States. And the Palestinian people have given up for reasons which are completely understandable. But the irony is, those who were in solidarity with the Palestinians works for decades, literally decades, to try to shift public opinion. And just as it shifted, the cause died.
Yeah. So I definitely want to touch on the one-state solution with you a little bit more. But I want to start off by kind of getting to kind of understand your upbringing a little bit better. So obviously you're Jewish yourself, and I know that you mentioned previously in other interviews that your parents, well, specifically your mother, she wasn't very religious at all.
My parents, let me just stop you there,
Sure.
if you don't mind, because I like the factual record to be exactly accurate.
Sure.
On political issues, my parents didn't disagree on anything.
Sure.
It was a strange sort of marriage. They disagreed in everything, sometimes violently disagreed in everything except politics.
Sure.
Politics, they were on the same page all the time. So you can feel free to say they as against my mother, because it was my parents.
So your father was more of a religious Jewish person?
No, absolutely not. He was just like my mother.
Okay.
Nothing to do with religion.
Sure. So that's kind of what I was referring to. So I know that previously in other interviews you had mentioned that they weren't practicing the religion.
They were not just not practicing, they were very anti-religion.
Okay.
Anti-religion. I mean, they were not neutral.
Mm-hmm.
They did not take what's sometimes called an agnostic position.
Yeah.
They were anti-religion for the simple reason, I don't want to offend anyone. People are entitled to their opinions. But after what they endured, they couldn't possibly believe there was a God. Period. Full stop. There was no question. There was not like a debate in my home about religion. You could not pronounce, literally, I'm not being poetic here. You literally could not pronounce the word God in my home. It was considered a combination of stupid, ignorant, stupid and ignorant. You couldn't say it in our home.
Sure.
It wasn't a matter of debate.
Now, obviously, with the Jewish identity, it's not just confined to the religious aspects of it. There are other aspects of that identity. But I wanna kind of get to know a little bit more on, or could you speak a little bit more on your own relationship with your Jewish identity, as in how involved are you with the culture, the community, or even the religion? I know you said your parents were, but what's your own relationship with all these things?
I'm not religious, obviously. I'm not as intolerant as my parents are religious people. One has to accept that many of the greatest minds in human history, not just in the humanities, but the greatest minds in math and science, they were deeply religious people. So I find it completely not credible to say that if you believe in religion, you have to be backward or primitive or stupid. That's just dumb to make that claim. You take one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, Ramanujan from India. He was deeply convinced that every formula he came up with came from God. He was deeply convinced of that. Now, he was clearly not a stupid person. And he was certainly had a mathematical and scientific mind. So to assume that somebody who believes in religion has to be an imbecile or primitive or backward, that doesn't click for me. Isaac Newton was a deeply religious person. You can't get around that. So I'm not of that school of thought which scorns or heaps contempt on religious believing on believers. So I'm not of that school. That my parents were of that school. I would not say because they were intolerant. I would say it was because they were bitter and angry at what befell them during World War II. And my mother, at any rate, blamed it in part on my father's religion, her father's religion, because he was a deeply religious man. My mother said more religious than many rabbis, deeply religious. They belonged to the Polish middle class. And when it was becoming clear that troubles were on the horizon with the Nazis, they had the resources to leave. And my mother's father was convinced that God would not let anything happen to the Jewish people, and so they stayed. And as much as my mother dearly loved her father till the end of her life, she never stopped heaping praise on him. She couldn't forgive because she said how stupid he was that they didn't leave when they had the opportunity to leave. So that's trying to account for my parents' intolerance of religion, intolerance of any concept of God, which I didn't inherit. I mean, I had it for a while. There was a period in my life, yes, I was intolerant, but I'm no longer there because I think intolerance in this matter, in this particular matter, I think it's very arrogant because it's to assume that anybody who disagrees with you must be stupid. But I've met a lot of religious people who are very smart. Sorry, you're not going to tell me that Ramanujan was stupid. That doesn't work for me.
I read in David Samuel's article on you on Tab magazine. He mentioned that you live in the most densely populated Jewish zip code in America.
Yeah, that's
so
probably right.
can you speak to your interactions with your community? Like, do you have a good relationship with them, or are you debating them every time you go to the grocery store?
No, I have no relationship with them. It's mostly Russian. It's mostly Russian Jews, with also Iraqi and Syrian Jews, and those are very close communities.
Yeah.
There's the language barrier, obviously, but there's also a cultural. Beyond the language is just a whole cultural dimension. But I feel perfectly safe here. I feel perfectly at home here. I've always lived in Jewish neighborhoods. I couldn't say my friends have been homogeneously Jewish because I don't claim to be a saint, but I don't choose friendships on the basis of anything except decency, trust, and politics. But politics is not a necessary element. I have friends who are not nearly as political as myself, but I trust them, and they're decent human beings.
Mm.
So I can't say my community of friends is homogeneously Jewish, because I don't even think about that. It's just not a factor in my calculation. I don't sit around and say a list. Here are my Jewish friends, here are my non-Jewish friends. I don't, that's not part of my mental framework. As to my connection with being Jewish, I don't have any formal connection. I don't go to synagogue. I don't honor the holidays, any of the holidays. I have no formal connection. However, I'm self-consciously Jewish. I couldn't imagine myself being not being Jewish. It's not physically possible. I always like to make the comparison when the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, when he passed in the late 1970s, there was a book that came out. It was entitled Mao Zedong and the Scales of History. And there were like 10 chapters, each discussing a different aspect of Mao. So it was Mao as a military strategist, Mao as a philosopher, Mao as a poet, Mao as a political leader, Mao as this, Mao as that. And then there was a chapter called Mao as a Chinese, Mao as a Chinese. And I distinctly remember the author of that chapter. He began by saying, this is a ridiculous subject, Mao as a Chinese, as if that were one aspect of his personality. Mao was saturated with being Chinese. Every gesture, every eye movement, every thought, every unconscious thought, subconscious thought, everything was Chinese. He was totally Chinese. And as you see, the way I'm saying that with my hand gestures, I'm totally Jewish. So the idea of separating out my Jewish aspect from my other aspects, I find ridiculous. It permeates every atom, every molecule of my body, the fact of being Jewish, even as I have no formal affiliations, no formal ties or bonds or connections with being Jewish. I am Jewish. I'm neither proud of it nor ashamed of it. It just is. That's just is who I am, period.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious though, because I did come across a portion in one of your books where you mentioned that growing up, Zionism wasn't too prominent within the Jewish community that you were part of.
It was non-existent.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand, the people don't, I'm not faulting anyone, it's people have no conception of what Israel was 50 or 60 years ago, 50 or 60 years ago. Israel was a very poor place, very poor. It was a very austere place. They lived a very simple life. American Jews, on the other hand, after World War II, were on the verge of making it in American society. So, in fact, there was a book, a famous book by an American Jew named Norman Finkelstein, and it was called Making It, which is to say, after World War II, all the formal barriers to Jewish opportunity, the various explicit and non-explicit forms of discrimination against Jews, all disappeared. And now Jews aspired very high. Jews are ambitious, very ambitious. They're ambitious and they're willing to invest the personal resources, the concentration, the discipline to achieve those ambitions. In other words, They're very hardworking. You can't take that away. It's a fact. They're very hardworking. And the hard work is born of a very high ambition and the willingness to invest the blood, sweat, and tears to achieving that ambition. So American Jews were looking to make it in American society. They didn't want to go to this austere, poor country, this tiny dot on the map called Israel, when they had the opportunity loomed of them entering into the highest precincts of American society. Now, that's not an exaggeration. So I went to a lower middle class high school. How did the people end up? Well, I'll give you an example. Chuck Schumer, the current Senate Majority Leader, he went to my high school. I remember his sister. I don't remember Chuck, but his sister, 3 years younger than him, friend. Brilliant young woman. At that time, girl. We're talking about high school. Brilliant. How did she dress? I have very vivid memories. Very simple, drab, you could say. Colorless, you can say. But brilliant and high ambition. Bernie Sanders went to my high school. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice who recently passed, went to my high school. 5, not 1, not 2, 3, 4, 5 Nobel laureates. 5 went to my high school, all Jewish. So when I say they now saw before them the possibility, the potential to being in the leading tier, the top stratum of American society, why would they care about Israel? Israel was a 0, 0, 0, -1. It's the place you gave a little money to grow a tree. That was a kind of common act among American Jews, just grow a tree in Israel. That's
Now,
it.
what was this like excuse me. Now, was this something that just publicly they didn't necessarily support it, or was it publicly they didn't support it, privately they didn't really
Nobody
care
talked
too much?
about it. It wasn't, the issues we talked about back then at a political level, it was the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement. At a personal level, it was about ambition. There was no religion back then. There are a couple of friends who later I realized were religious, but it was very quiet. You carried on your, so to speak, religious life, but it wasn't part of our public presentation of each other. It was just a quiet aspect of one's personal existence. But at that time, all we talked about on a personal level, the only thing we talked about were grades, school, grades, school, grades, school. Of course, we had our personal traumas and depressions and all that sort of stuff. But back then, you didn't talk about that much either. You were ashamed. Now everybody talks about every trauma in their life, beginning with birth, and being circumcised. But back then, you didn't do that. It was considered an embarrassment to publicly articulate your personal anguishes and torments. So it was mostly, there were boyfriends and girlfriends within a very grade school level.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about those things.
Obviously, Zionism has become more prominent within the Jewish community, like as time went on. Obviously, after the 1967 war, that was a big jump for Zionism within the Jewish American community. But I'm curious, were you ever intrigued by it? Were you ever, a supporter of it? Did you ever have a moment where, you looked at it as something that could be potentially good for the Jewish community?
No, because I was deeply influenced by my parents, probably too much, too influenced, and even to this day, I have to say I feel deep regret about not having taken a more critical stand. I wasn't able to, for various psychological reasons. I just couldn't make a firm break with them, but they were very anti-Zionist, very anti-Israel. They considered Israel to be a puppet of the West, in particular the United States. My parents are very pro-Soviet, pro-Russian, and so there was never any positive feeling. My eldest brother did feel an affection for Israel. He went to live there and was for quite a few, I would say a couple of decades. He was not an uncritical, but he was a passionate defender of Israel. But then he actually went further to the left than me. He came to hate it. I think it was because I don't know the psychological mechanisms, but I think part of it was he realized he had been fooled. So they used to say there's no anti-communist like an ex-communist.
Yeah.
And I think my brother sort of like there's no anti-Zionist like an ex-Zionist, that he felt betrayed and fooled, and then he saw that this place is just really quite horrible.
Do you think that kind of, I guess, realization, do you think that that's partially why so many people, especially now from the Jewish community, are beginning to speak out against Zionism and beginning to speak out about Israel specifically? Because we are starting to see a good amount of Jewish
Yeah,
organizations coming up that are anti
yeah. I think
Israel.
under age of 35, I would say the predominant feeling among American Jews is critical to the point of anti-Israel, except for the highly religious Jews, which in the United States is still a quite small percentage, I think 10%. Apart from that group who are fanatically pro-Israel, the under 35, I think because Israel came to represent, American Jews are liberal, moderate liberal, they're at that end of the spectrum. And Israel is so closely aligned with the Republican right wing that it's impossible to be a liberal or even moderate American Jew and pro-Israel when Israel is the darling of the Republican far right, not just right, but also far right. So for American Jews, younger Jews in particular, that's an impossible contradiction.
Yeah.
You cannot square that circle. This country, if you look at public opinion polls, there's only one other country in the world, I can't remember which, where the population was overwhelmingly pro-Trump. And that just didn't go down well for American Jews.
Yeah.
So for that reason alone, the American Jews have become very anti-Israel, critical to the point of anti-Israel.
Yeah, I see. Now, you've said on record that you are not pro-Palestine, nor are you pro-Israel, rather you're pro-justice. Now, I think that there's definitely a brilliance in that, in the ability to be, you're impartial when you're exploring this topic. So my question to you would be,
I would qualify that.
Sure.
I'm not impartial exploring the topic. I'm very partial to truth, and I'm very partial to justice. I am ethnically impartial.
Yes, yes. So I guess my question related to that is, what would your advice be to, let's say, a young Jewish person or a young Arab person who's looking to explore this topic, or any topic for that matter, but might come into it kind of already indoctrinated with certain biases going in, whether they're ethnic, whether they're political? How would you what would your advice be to them to avoid the trap of confirmation bias and approaching topics like this emotionally, so that they avoid being blinded by what they want to hear, what they want to perceive as the truth, rather than what is that impartial truth, or that unquestionable truth. Sorry.
I would say study the strongest arguments for your side, study the strongest arguments against your side, look for sources which any reasonable person would consider authoritative, that is to say, human rights organizations which have a respectable track record, authors who are known for their ability to, at least to some extent, suspend their bias and render the facts as they are. Hear the best case on both sides, and then try to the best of your ability, and we're all human, so it's not perfect, to suspend one's what you call confirmation bias, and try to make the reasonable judgment, always keeping in mind that to the extent that you're letting your biases govern you, you might end up placing yourself on the side of injustice. And that's not just an abstract term, justice, injustice. It means placing yourself on the side of those who are inflicting real harm, real cruelty, on real suffering on other human beings. So as you sort through the arguments on both sides, you should always be cognizant of the human consequences of being wrong and aligning yourself. Let's not call it, for the moment, let's not call it evil, though it is evil, but aligning yourself with policies, with persons who inflict real hurt, harm, suffering, torment on human beings. So it's not just an academic game. When you're sorting out the arguments, you're sorting out the arguments on an issue which has real human consequences. And do you really want to go there? I mean, you have to really fight it. But do you really want to fall into the injustice camp? Because the injustice camp is not just some abstract value. It's about real human suffering.
I see. Now, you've obviously supported a two-state solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict for a while.
Yeah, I hate to constantly stop you. You're a very nice young man, and I don't want to be rude. I would not say that's accurate. I've never supported anything. It's not my business to support anything. What I have tried to do is look at the most realistic possibility for achieving something that will diminish the suffering of the Palestinian people, and which is the furthest one can realistically hope for, before ending up isolating yourself, marginalizing yourself, and basically just showing the world how radical you are, but are politically an irrelevance. So,
now,
on the basis of those criteria, what's the maximum that's realistically possible that can actually diminish the suffering of the Palestinians? Those are my criteria, and those criteria, I concluded that the two states was the only realistic, the maximally realistic possibility.
Do you think that is still the most viable solution for the conflict today?
Well, actually, yes and no. Yes, because there have been cracks in the consensus. For example, the human rights organizations, there have been cracks. They're now moving in the direction of one state. However, if you look at the various other arenas, the UN General Assembly, the regional consensus in the Middle East now, it's now in the General Assembly, it's still as pro two states as it ever was. Regionally, it's now completely aligned with Israel, aside from Iran and what remains of Syria and Hezbollah. Regionally, it's no states, it's just Israel as a colonial power aligned with the Gulf states and Egypt, Jordan, and all the rest. So there it's bleaker. In the UN General Assembly, it's still pretty stable, but without any practical import. The other thing is, I think the question is completely irrelevant because there's no movement anymore. I don't know what's going to happen in Israel and Palestine. I don't know. Maybe a new movement will emerge. Then I have to wait to listen to what their demands are. What will they be calling for? Maybe they'll call for one state. Maybe they'll call for a binational state. Maybe they'll still call for a Palestinian state. I have no idea. There's no movement now, and therefore it's completely pointless for people in the West to be debating this. It becomes just, preening and posturing for cameras to show everybody how radical you are. So I don't see the point of that discussion now. If somebody is serious, they want to do something, they genuinely are moved by the suffering of the Palestinians, then the focus should be on practical things like trying still to lift the blockade of Gaza. That's a practical thing which people should focus on.
Yeah.
But there's no discussion any longer of one state, two states, 10 states, no states any longer, Israel, Palestine. It's dead. We have to be clear about that. There's no, the Palestinian so-called authority, it's just a kleptocratic dictator.
So why do you think that is, Norman? I know like many people are becoming tired of this conflict. They're feeling hopeless that, any change is going to come. They're beginning to lose their faith, I guess, in the international community to administer justice on their behalf. Do you think that that's part of the reason why we're beginning to see this, let's say, lack of momentum within the Palestinian
I don't think it's
organizations?
mysterious. I don't think it's mysterious at all. Israel, with the United States, but primarily Israel, their strategy worked. Their strategy at Oslo was, they figured, hey, Palestinian Arabs are no different than any other Arabs. You can find a group of people who, with sufficient resources, you can buy them off. That's the whole Arab world. Gangs of crooks are heading up states. And so they decided, because the PLO, you probably won't remember these things, but after the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, all the money, and Arafat's more or less, it was not entirely true, but it was true enough. Arafat's support of Saddam Hussein, all the money from the Gulf that was enriching the PLO terminated. The PLO was broke. And Arafat without money is like a juggler without balls. That's how he managed the PLO. He bought everybody off. Money here, money there, buy here, buy there, buy there. He bought everyone off. And so at that point, he was bankrupt, and people were saying the PLO was finished. Bye-bye PLO, as I think it's the big new Brzezinski famously said. He said it prematurely, but it was true. Bye-bye PLO. So at that point, Israel threw the PLO a lifeline. And the lifeline was, we'll keep you above water if you do our bidding. And that was the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement was Israel agreed to save the PLO, which was on the verge of bankruptcy, if it would do the bidding of Israel. Arafat, the PLO head, Yasser Arafat, he agreed to it, first of all, because the alternative was to return to the wilderness, and he wasn't about to do that. The second thing was he was very vain, stupid man, and he thought he could trick the West, that he would get into the occupied territories, he would get his 25,000 person security force, and he would trick. Well, you're not tricking the West. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. They were a lot smarter than him, and he wasn't going to trick anybody. And the PLO was already completely corrupt because it was, as I said, Arafat handled, bought off everybody through money, or he killed them. I mean, that was another option. So they were prepared to be bought off. One of the most interesting things about the Oslo Agreement, the second one was called Oslo II in 1995, Oslo II. One of the most interesting things about that agreement, which nobody comments on, I'm the only one who commented on, probably the only one who read it, it's large. There's a section, pages 192 to 196, 4 pages, 1, 2, 3, 4 pages on treatment of VIPs, very important people. So there were VIPs 1, VIPs 2, VIPs 3. There were all these detailed delineations of how to treat Palestinian VIPs. Okay? Where did political prisoners fit into the Oslo Agreement? The political prisoners, believe it or not, it's almost funny. Political prisoners was the very last page of the agreement, and it was 3/4 of a page. VIPs, 4 pages. Political, each one, all the Palestinians are struggling. They want to be VIP 1 or VIP 2, because that means, the difference between a Mercedes and a Cadillac. No, it's serious. I'm very serious about it. It's a difference between having a car that say you could travel to Israel versus a car that says you could travel around the world. That's all they cared about. These are the most crooked people on God's earth. So that was the essence. And guess what? It worked. I remember I knew a guy back then. I'll give his name. He's a very nice guy, extremely nice guy. Ghassan Andoni. He's was at the time a physicist at Birzeit University. And he supported the Oslo Agreement, even though he was active. He served many years in jail, was tortured, the typical plight of a Palestinian in occupied territories. And he said, oh, so if Israel ends up not giving us a state, we'll just take our 25,000 person army, because that's what Oslo allowed for, 25,000, 15 or 20,000, I think it's 25, but I could be mistaken. Could have been 15. A 15,000 person security force, as it was called. And we'll just turn it on Israel. Well, no, not so smart, not so fast. The security force, they trained it in Jordan with the CIA. It's a ruthless security force, and you're not going to turn that. That's their job. That's what they get paid for. I remember my best friend, his name is Musa Abu Heshesh. He was until his retirement this year, he was the field representative for that B'Tselem Human Rights Organization in the Hebron district, Al Khalil. And he had a brother, Nur, N-U-R. He had a brother, Nur, who joined the Palestinian police force. And he was very poor, Nur, very, very poor. And poor in that part of the world means you can't get married. So it was a deeply frustrating experience for the young man. Now he gets into the police force. The first thing, they give him a car. Okay, Nur, who was dirt poor, now has a car. Nur can now get married, and he did get married very quickly and had kids. And I remember I turned to Nur one day because his brother, Musa, was very active politically. And I said to him, Nur, if the Palestinian Authority tells you to arrest your dad, will you arrest him? He said, yes. And that stayed with me. You know, that's a long time ago. It's 1995. So we're talking about more than a quarter century ago. But I'll never forget that, because at that moment, it registered to me, Israel won. It created an Arab regime. Yes, he wanted that car. He wanted to raise his family.
So
And
is it surprising to you to hear that, I guess, more and more proclaimed pro-Palestinian activists and outlets like Al Jazeera, which support the Palestinian cause, does it surprise you to see that they're pushing more and more this idea of a one-state solution, as opposed to holding on to something which they no longer see as viable?
It has no connection to reality. You can call for 10 states. You can call for 200 states. But what connection is that to any reality that's being lived right now? It's like we have an economic crisis in the United States, all right? It's a serious one. And there doesn't seem to be any idea about how to break out of the impasse, the dead end of our economy. Since the 1980s, workers' wages just keep going down. So somebody says, well, I just read Karl Marx's Capital, and I think the solution is to abolish money. Well, how would you react to a person who said in the midst of this crisis to abolish money? Does it have, I think Marx is right, that in order to create a just society, we have to abolish money. I happen to agree with that. I think the old adage that money is the root of all evil is probably true. But would you say that's a practical solution to the current economic crisis?
No.
Would you say it has any relevance whatsoever?
No.
Would you say that anybody espousing it is slightly insane?
Yeah.
So
that would be a fair assessment.
I feel, in my opinion, that's the same applies to all these discussions about one state or two states. They have no connection with reality. There are no Palestinians struggling anymore. The minimum in politics to achieve any goal, the so to speak, oppressed side, to achieve any goal, it requires two things: leadership and organization. Absent leadership and organization, nothing can happen. Period, full stop. You can have explosions. You can have violent outbursts. But in the absence of leadership and the organization, they dissipate. They disappear.
So why do you think this idea is being pushed then? Like, why are they talking about it? Why are they pushing this idea?
Because
I mean, they can't all be, crazy. They can't all be stupid. They can't all be.
It's radical chic. It's this kind of posturing in front of the mirror. Look how radical I am. I've never been a radical. I mean, I am a radical. I'm a person of the far left, and I'm not. That's not about to change. But in Israel Palestine, I've said that two states seems to me the only realistic option right now, which offers the maximum possible that Palestinians can achieve. Whereas there were many in the academic community who were all for one state. They were calling me a liberal Zionist, which I find kind of funny, to tell you the truth. But here's the bottom line. they all kept their jobs. I lost mine. Why is that? Why is it the person with the least radical position ended up out of work, and all of those advocating one state and uh, uh, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? How is it they all ended up keeping their jobs? And in my opinion, it's because everybody knew that what they were saying, I mean, the people in power knew what they were saying was completely irrelevant. So let them say whatever they want. Let them chant till the end of time. It doesn't have any real impact. Whereas in here, as I say, ego is a factor, and I have to be careful about that. But I feel I was having an impact. Wherever I was going, you're much too young to remember. Wherever I spoke, it could be the smallest school on God's earth. There would always be between 500 and 1,000 people, even between 500 and 1,500 people. Wherever I spoke, whenever I spoke, I was drawing real crowds, and I was convincing. I knew the facts. I studied hard. I worked very hard. I worked fanatically to get all the facts right. So I think the reason I lost my job is that the Jewish organizations were determined to stop me because I was having an impact. Whereas you could say from the river to the sea to the end of time has nothing to do with reality.
Now, what do you say to, I would say, the individuals that look at the facts on the ground, let's say, or the reality on the ground in Palestine, and see that a lot of the land is being, annexed, or it's being taken over by settlements?
It has been annexed. I do not agree that they should be referred to as occupied territories anymore. They should be referred to as the annexed territories of Israel.
But what do you say to the people that say, well, supporting this idea of a two-state solution, it's not like, we don't see it on the ground. We don't care what the record says. We don't care what the precedent is. On the ground, we see a one state.
I think there's a problem here. The problem is you're not listening to me, not because you're not a good listener, but because of what you call conviction bias.
Sure.
You want to demonstrate that somehow what I'm saying is not relevant, but you're not listening. So
I'm just asking the question.
I'm not angry at all. You're a delightful young man. I'm just trying to explain what I think is going on here.
Sure.
There's a very big difference between what is factually on the ground and what's politically possible. So let's take a simple example. There's an immigration problem with Mexicans in the United States, right? It's a big political issue, constantly talked. It started up again when Ron DeSantis of Florida sent these immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, which is a liberal enclave, and say, you like immigrants so much? Here, we're going to give you some. Let's see what you do with them, okay? So there's an immigration problem, okay? Now, there are about 30 million Mexicans in the United States, 30 million Americans, 1/10 of our population, a little less than 1/10 of our population, who trace their heritage back to Mexico. The Mexican economy, it's completely dependent on Mexicans working here, sending money back to Mexico, okay? And the United States annexed 2/3 of Mexico. California, New Mexico, Arizona, these are all part of Mexico. So geographically, demographically, economically, the obvious solution to the problem of what's called illegal immigration to the United States, the obvious solution is eliminate the border. That's the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground point to the solution, eliminate the border. 1/10 of our population, nearly 1/10 is already Mexican. the Mexican economy is dependent on what are called remittances from Mexicans working in the United States. And if you go to that part of Southwest United States, you still see the Mexican architecture. So the obvious solution is the facts on the ground, as you put them, is to eliminate the border. Now, I ask you, if somebody articulate as the solution to the question of immigration, abolishing the border, would you say that's realistic?
Definitely in the case of US Mexico, it's not realistic.
It's not realistic.
But the reality in Palestine is that we're trying to figure out how these people that are essentially living in limbo, they're living in a situation where they're governed by individuals that they did not vote into power. They are governed by a military that does not represent their interests and is actually there to take away their land. So it is a slightly different situation. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the difference of the two situations.
My thoughts are, as of now, there is no active political force in Palestine that is aspiring to anything. There's nothing there now. There is an organizational vacuum and there's a leadership vacuum. And I'm not going to prejudge the situation until a leadership and organization emerge which authoritatively reflect the aspirations of the overwhelming number of Palestinian people, and then hear what they have to say, then to judge it against what Marxists like to call, and every reasonable political person would call, the correlation of political forces. That means what's possible, what's not possible. And on the basis of that, I'll reach a conclusion, whether I think the platform being articulated by this authoritative political leadership, whether I think it's realistic or not. But right now, none of that exists. So I don't know why we're talking about. It's like people want something, if you don't mind my saying it, they want something sexy. They want, one state from the river to the sea. And I said, if you're serious, you're talking about now lifting the blockade of Gaza. That's what you'll be talking about. No offense to you, but you didn't ask any questions about that. If you ask anyone in Gaza, what's your first priority, one state or ending the blockade? What do you think they would say?
Of course, ending the blockade.
Yeah, but nobody here is interested in that.
Yeah.
That to me is the problem. Nobody here is interested in that. They want to talk about one state or two states. They can never stop talking about it. Who wants to talk about the blockade, ending the blockade? That's not fun. That's not interesting. It's all right, blockade, who cares? Let's go have our cappuccino.
Yeah.
It's not serious. That's why I dropped out. I don't speak on it anymore. So it's clear to me it was completely unserious at this point.
Okay. Now, I know you visited Iran in the past. I'm curious to know what your experience was like as a Jewish man and as an American man in Iran. What was that like from, I guess, judging the government and the people? Like, what was that like for you?
It was a long time ago now. I can't even remember, to tell you the truth.
Sure.
And since then, I had a visit from 2 FBI agents who told me not to do it again.
Okay.
And I decided it wasn't worth having another tangle with the law over this because, no, not sure. I don't want to. It was an issue, but I didn't see. If I were going there and there was an important event, then I would go and I would risk the problems with the law. But I didn't see it as. I haven't received any invitations, which would. Mostly they invite me to go to Holocaust denier conferences.
Oh, wow.
Which is just stupid.
You're inviting the wrong person.
They're very confused in that issue because they think because I wrote The Holocaust Industry, and only God knows how it was translated into Persian, that I'm on their side of that issue, which obviously I'm not. So I went there once. It was when I went to town meetings, all they wanted to talk about was the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust. I said at one meeting, I said, my God, you know, you'll be surprised to hear this, but you have something in common with Israel. And you're the only two countries in the world that have that in common. They said, what's that? I said, because in Israel and the United States, the only thing people want to talk about is the Holocaust. I mean, Israel and Iran, the only thing people want to talk about is the Holocaust. So then they started calling me a CIA agent.
Oh, wow.
How
was it like exploring the city? Like what were your impressions of being there? What was the reception by the people?
I was closely supervised.
Oh, okay.
No, because why I should be closely supervised. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't speak the language. So it's totally dependent. I mean, I couldn't just walk up to somebody in the street and say, can you direct me to Times Square? It was, I didn't know what I was doing. So I was closely supervised. But I did speak my mind. I went on television shows and they start with the Holocaust stuff. I just said, you're barking up the wrong tree. It happened. I said at one point, I said, it happened. It was horrible, but you had nothing to do with it. So get over it.
So obviously, I mean, Iran is kind of been in the news lately. Pertaining to the case of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old girl that passed away in custody. And I'm just wondering.
It's correct to say passed away. Was she killed?
I mean, there are conflicting reports. We do know that she ultimately passed away. Some say that there was a pre-existing condition that caused to her, getting a heart attack and passing away. Others say that she was beaten. I'm not sure where the truth lies.
But let's not say passed away. Let's just say
died.
She died. Yeah.
Sure, she died. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the case as a whole, and I'm wondering, why do you think that this story specifically has sparked such media coverage, especially in the Western world?
Well, the last question is easy to answer because the Western press is fantastically hypocritical and just basically news outlets for the U.S. administration. They're organs of, for all intents and purposes, they're organs of state power. No difference in substance than the organs of state power in Russia or China. Even though I'm told on many issues, now I don't know this because I don't know the languages, but people who do know the languages say that on many issues, I think on Ukraine, for example, I think Russian media is more trustworthy than American. I'm not saying that as a joke. I'm saying it objectively. I think it's probably more trustworthy than American. The American media on Ukraine is it's an organ of the CIA, not even the organ of the CIA. There's nothing in it that. On Ukraine, I just look at the headlines out of curiosity. I look at the New York Times. I don't actually read the articles because there's nothing there. It's just pure propaganda. So when you say why the West is so preoccupied with Iran, I think that's not a,
so sorry, just I want to re-clarify my question. Why are they so interested in this story specifically? Like, why do you think that is?
It combines everything they want. They get to show how backward the Iranians are, and because of the whole issue of women's rights, and they get to attack an official enemy of the U.S. government. So there's a convergence of what you might call the woke agenda with the ruling elite agenda. It works perfectly. Sure. Woke people, oppressed Iranian women, and the ruling elite. Obviously, Iran is a formidable adversary in the Middle East. So that to me is not complicated. That's kind of stares you in the face. The more complicated question is, to what extent are the demonstrations indigenous as against being manipulated by the West? And to what extent those who are participating are articulate the genuine sentiments of the Iranian people as against the sentiments which have been, to some extent, fabricated by these non-governmental organizations or Iranians who are trying to be like the West. You know, soon you'll have a headline in the New York Times, transgender women attacked in Iranian demonstration, you know. So, and that answer I can't give. I think it was clear. I said so at the time. I was a minority of one. I thought that in the contested election at the time of the Green demonstrations in Iran, I thought Ahmadinejad won. I felt it then. I think I've since been vindicated. Most of the post-election commentary or scholarship came down that he did win that contested election because whether you like it or not, the Islamist regime was quite popular. I did notice I was in Iran on National Day, since you mentioned my trip. And there was no question that there were huge masses of people out in the street in Tehran. Now, I can't speak for other cities, but it was, so to speak, a huge demonstration of popular support. How huge, I can't calculate. But these were not people who were they were not bussed in, they were not forced to, no, they were there on their own volition, and they were hugely popular. Okay, I have to be careful. They were clearly popular. Hugely, I can't judge, but to say that these are all fabricated demonstrations, just like now in the referendums or referenda that are being held in the Ukraine, I think there's a good chance that in those areas of the Donbass, what are called the Russian-speaking areas, I think it's a good chance they will choose to be aligned with Russia, because there was an 8-year war going on. It wasn't reported here, but there was an 8-year war going on between the Ukraine and those areas, and lots of people were killed. And I think for because by Ukrainian nationalists who didn't like Russian-speaking Ukrainians. So I think there is a good chance that they will choose to be in what is clearly a repressive state, Russia. And Putin is, you know, a thug, like most world leaders. Erdogan any better? Not really. Biden, well, Biden's brain dead, so that just makes him a little bit weaker. I would say one has to wait and see how popular these demonstrations are. Obviously, anybody who killed a young woman should be held culpable for the crime. That to me goes without saying. And on the demand itself, I have to wait to see what the demands are. And I have to then wait to see, first of all, I have to wait to see what the demands are. And secondly, I have to wait to see how popular they are before I were to make a judgment. I thought Ahmadinejad won that election, and democracy, majority rule. They won. You don't like it, then you have to work harder. Sure. And if you struggle to achieve your democratic rights, in particular the right to decide who's going to decide your fate, then of course I'm going to support you. Mm-hmm. I do believe here I'm in a minority. I acknowledge. I think in all cultural questions, They are not easily resolved. They're not easily resolved because culture and tradition contain what have to be described as utterly irrational elements. Let's take a simple example. I live near the beach. I live near Coney Island Beach in Brooklyn. So you see women walking on the boardwalk or along the seashore, and their bathing suit consists of one string. It's one string. It's like from a spool of thread that is so designed that it covers or appears to cover certain parts of the body which otherwise, if they were exposed, would be against the law. Okay, now it's one string. Okay, so it doesn't cover very much, clearly. If she has that string on, it's legal. If somebody were to come along with a scissor and just snip the string and it fell off, it becomes illegal. She is exposing herself in public, and that's a crime in the US. Is there anything rational in that? The string makes you legal without the string, which is, as I said, like the thread on a spool. It makes it legal. Without the string, it's illegal. It's totally arbitrary. Cultural norms are in large part completely arbitrary. So when you want to protest the veil and you say that's repressive of women's rights, but there is a consensus, let's say in my classes where I teach, a woman can't come in bare-breasted. She cannot. A guy cannot come to my class wearing Speedos. He cannot. So what makes one form of attire repressive, the other form of attire not oppressive? What is the rule? Where is the rational line drawn? There is no rational line drawn. There are many aspects of culture and tradition which are just completely irrational. So I find it difficult to have a firm position on things like this, because I don't believe drawing the line anywhere makes it more or less rational than anywhere else.
I see. Iran also was in the news lately pertaining to an agreement or an organization that they teamed up with, I guess, or joined, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They met up in Uzbekistan, Putin and Xi Jinping. I'm wondering, what do you think this means for the region? What do you think this means for the West? And what do you think it means for Iran?
I haven't followed it closely enough to comment. I would say, broadly speaking, there's clearly a realignment occurring on the world stage, where the US and Europe, but Europe as a subgroup, are one axis and China is the other axis. I have been on the opinion from the beginning that the Ukraine war was not about Ukraine. The Ukraine war was about China. It's a testing ground. It's a testing ground. Ukraine is basically Taiwan. Right now, they're stirring up trouble with Ukraine, but only as a pilot project for stirring up trouble with Taiwan against China. It has a long history. Even under Obama, there was what was called the Asian pivot. That's the expression they kept meaning. And the Asian pivot basically meant we have to look out for China. China is the great adversary. And it was clear even during the Ukrainian war, with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and then now the weapons deals that are being uh, uh, considered with Taiwan, that the United States, in my view, and I have to admit I've not studied it closely, but the US is very determined to put China in its place. And I think there is a real possibility of war with China. There's a real possibility of war with China because the United States has only one weapon in its arsenal. And its weapon is weapons. It doesn't have anything else. Well, it has its cultural power, that's for sure. I can't doubt that. But in terms of economic power, no. I don't think that's correct anymore. China is, you have the feel of a dynamic economy. And in the case of the US, you have the feel of an economy that stumbles from one crisis to the next. It's a declining economic power. The US is a complete mess.
And so do you think that these types of agreements are just people picking sides?
Yeah, I think it's part of the alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think Iran would prefer the US side. It would prefer the US side. But it doesn't have that option. You might recall that from the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, of all people, Henry Kissinger was saying, "What are you doing?" to the Biden administration. You're crazy. You're throwing Russia into the arms of China. What are you doing? He said, "Our enemy is China. What are you doing now? You're giving China a gift with this whole thing." So he understood what the real stakes were. The real stakes are China. And he thought this whole Ukraine thing was completely crazy. I think he still does. He hasn't changed his mind on that. So, yes, it's picking sides because those are the two axes. It's sort of like, as you know, in the Middle East, there is the Israel-Saudi axis and there's the Iran-Syria axis, and everybody is picking sides.
Now, you did mention that I guess you said that Iran would prefer to be with the West.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious because obviously they have their conflict with Israel, or that kind of standoff with Israel.
I don't think they don't have a conflict with Israel.
That standoff with Israel. Do
Yeah,
you think that
each wants to dominate the Middle East.
Now, do you think that they would prefer to like replace Israel and be America's go-to? Is that kind of the idea that you think is out there, or what do you think it is, or what is it exactly that you mean when you say Iran prefers to be with America as opposed to China or Russia?
Because they still see, I don't think it's correct, but they do still see the United States as the most formidable power now and into the future, and they rather align with it. Be on the receiving end, which is right now what they are. They're on the receiving end of the U.S. sanctions and the U.S. bullying and the U.S. threats. But also, I think there is a general worshiping of the United States in most of the Arab world. I think that's, there are some exceptions. I think that Nasrallah, Hassan Nasrallah from the Hezbollah, he doesn't worship the West. He's an unusual character. He's very similar in that way to Gandhi in India and Mao Zedong in China, in the sense that he is confident of and proud of his Arab Muslim heritage. He doesn't suffer from an inferiority complex. And that was the same thing, that was true of Gandhi and Mao. People contrast Gandhi and Mao, but I think their similarities were much more remarkable than their contrasts. Okay, and the question of violence, I'm not gonna quarrel. There was a difference, but you take Gandhi. Once Gandhi returned from South Africa to India, he only left India once. during what the 1932, what were called the roundtable discussions on the future of India in the British Empire. Mao, once he came into power, he only left China twice to visit Russia, twice. Never went anywhere else. And you get the same feeling with Hassan Nasrallah. They feel comfortable, each of them felt comfortable in their own skin. Gandhi is an Indian, Mao is a Chinese, Nasrallah as an Arab Muslim. They feel comfortable in their skin, they feel confident in their skin, they feel proud in their skin. Each knows the ancient heritage of his or her, in this case, his. Each knows the ancient heritage of his people, his country, and there's a rich history and tradition. But most of the Arabs, like most of the third world leaders, they just worship the West. They may claim they're anti-American, but they're not. They're not. They're really.
So do you think that Iran also suffers from this worship of
Yes,
the West?
I do think they are cognizant of the fact that the Persian history, the Persian culture, it's an impressive history and culture. No question about that. But I still say lurking beneath is this worshiping of the West and of the United States.
Yeah. So what do you think is holding them back from establishing a relationship with the United States? Is it just their position on Israel, or?
I think a lot. I'm not sure where Israel ends and the United States begins. Look, there were obviously very big differences because the original Iranian agreement, the Israel lobby was completely against it. Netanyahu was completely against it. The Israel lobby invested huge amounts of money to try to stop it. They couldn't stop it because once our government reached the conclusion that the deal is good for us, you can't stop it. No amount of Jewish power can stop it. There was the consensus in the Obama administration and among the leading Jewish legislators. The only exceptions were Chuck Schumer in New York and Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey. Apart from them, all of the Jewish leadership supported the Iranian deal. So once the US government made the decision to support it, it was a done deal, regardless of what Netanyahu said, regardless of what the Israel lobby said. Now, the Biden administration was supposed to begin where Obama left off on Iran, but there seem to be mixed feelings in the administration about whether they are able to extract more from Iran in terms of concessions. How much of that is due to the Israel influence? I can't tell. I can't tell.
So maybe you would say that there is maybe a partial influence by Israel to kind of sour the relationship between Iran and the US.
There's definitely that element, but it wasn't successful in the past. Remember, Biden was Obama's vice president, and he didn't oppose the Iran agreement. Okay. I think now there seems to be a feeling that you can extract more, but it's become very complicated, as you know, because of the Ukrainian situation. They need the Iranian oil. So,
I've heard in the past a lot of let's say pre-1979 Iranians claim that the current regime was essentially supported or put into power with the support of the United States, as opposed to essentially sabotage Iranian the Iranian Shah's growth or essentially expansion in the region. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that the current regime is in opposition more than it was in alignment?
Completely crazy. I mean, I just recently read Jimmy Carter's memoirs. He was the president of the United States at the time. It was clear he completely supported the Shah. I mean, to the point, I think what Jimmy Carter became is quite admirable. No question in my mind about that. And he's a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant guy, or was. Now he's 99, but was a brilliant guy. But when it came in his memoir, the discussion of Iran, it was just so horrible. He said, how could the Iranians mistreat our hostages? And he was so indignant. And you're thinking of the tens of thousands of people who went through the Savak torture chambers, which were trained, staffed by American trained CIA, trained them in the torture, and he just doesn't see any of it. He was completely pro-Iranian, pro-Shah. The idea that he would have masterminded, it's so nutty. But I was going to say, conspiracy theories are so pervasive in the Arab world, but they're pervasive here too. Our country is descending into sheer lunacy. Hillary, everything now in the United States, you don't follow it, and you shouldn't, because you'd go mad. Everything now is a conspiracy by Putin. They say, the headlines of the Times, you go look at it later. Putin was behind Russian trolls trying to divide the women's movement. Yeah, Putin's behind Russian trolls trying to divide the women's movement. And it's huge pictures in pink and huge headlines. Putin trying to divide the women's movement.
I had an excellent time speaking to Professor Norman Finkelstein. The man is full of wisdom and full of knowledge, and I am grateful for the fact that he was willing to share some of that wisdom and some of that knowledge with me in our brief conversation. We spent a little bit over an hour and a half together in discussion, and it was an amazing conversation. I walked away with it with a lot of new insights. If you enjoyed this episode, then make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more episodes similar to this in the future. And thank you so much for watching.